40 rings inside the trunk of a white oak take 40 years to grow, and Renata Voss knew that before she gave the order at 5:30 in the morning, because I had told her so myself, plainly and without any particular heat, 6 weeks before her crew arrived with the chainsaws. She knew the age of the tree, she knew it stood entirely on my land, and she had in her possession a county survey that said so on page 4. In a column of figures she had signed her name beneath the previous spring. None of that stopped her. She had calculated, as she had calculated in 3 neighborhoods before mine, that the cost of stopping her was higher than the cost of letting her proceed, and she was confident, the way people are confident when they have never once been seriously challenged, that the man standing in the path of her equipment was the sort of man who would eventually walk away. Stay until the end of this account, because what Renata Voss understood about documentation, and what she failed to understand about me, turned out to be 2 entirely different things. My name is Declan Marsh. I am 32 years old, and I have owned the house at 14 Sycamore Terrace for 4 years, and what follows is a record of every act she committed and every document she produced. And of the morning a county judge opened his ruling by reading aloud the number 40 and asking, in a voice that carried to the back of the room, who had authorized the destruction of something that had been alive since before anyone present was born. The tree is gone. The stump is still there, ringed in contractor chalk from the forensic arborist's core sample. And Renata Voss is no longer the board representative for the Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association, nor the board representative for anything else. What follows explains why, in the order that it happened, beginning on the morning I moved in. I had left a surveying job with the county assessor's office to buy the house outright, using savings and a modest inheritance, because the property sat on a 1/4 acre of land that included a white oak I had admired from the road for 2 years before it ever came on the market. The tree was 40 feet tall, with a canopy spread of 38 feet, and the county assessor's records, which I had read professionally before I was a homeowner, placed its trunk 11 feet inside my eastern boundary. I am saying this not to establish sentiment, but to establish standing, because the distinction would matter considerably in the months ahead. Renata Voss introduced herself to me 8 days after I moved in. She was 51 years old, blonde, with her hair set in a smooth chignon that did not move in the wind, and she wore a red blazer over a white shirt, the way some women wear a uniform, as though the combination were the visual argument she was making before she opened her mouth. She arrived at the front of my driveway on a Saturday morning with a neighbor I had not yet met, a quiet man named Philip Dern who served as her deputy on the board, and she announced rather than asked that the oak tree's root system was impacting the shared drainage easement that ran along the eastern side of my lot line. I told her, quietly, that I was familiar with the drainage easement, that I had reviewed the plat before purchase, and that the easement ran 2 feet inside the lot line, making the tree's trunk 9 feet from any portion of the easement. She told me she had received complaints from residents on the adjoining parcel. I asked her to show me the written complaints. She said the complaints had been verbal. I told her I understood, and I said I would be glad to review any written notice the association produced in the proper form and would respond in kind. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who has just discovered a minor inconvenience where they expected to find an open door. Philip Dern said nothing. She said the association had broad authority under the governing documents to address nuisance vegetation, and I told her plainly that I had read the governing documents, which defined nuisance vegetation as any plant extending into a common area or easement, and that the oak did neither. She repeated the word broad. I said I looked forward to her written notice. She left without one. I photographed the canopy and the root flare that same afternoon, walked the eastern boundary with a tape measure, recorded the measurements on video with the timestamp running, and sent a copy of the county survey to my own email address so the delivery timestamp would establish that I held it before any dispute was formally opened. It was the kind of habit that used to feel like professional reflex and, in the months ahead, began to feel like prophecy. 3 weeks after Renata Voss's first visit, a certified letter arrived from Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association, signed by her, informing me that the oak tree at my property had been identified as a hazard tree under Association Bylaw 11, subsection C, and that I had 30 days to arrange for its removal at my own expense, or the association would arrange removal and bill me for the cost, plus a 15% administrative fee. The letter cited an arborist report. I requested a copy of the arborist report the same day by certified letter of my own. What arrived 12 days later was a single page, unsigned, that listed my address and the tree's approximate dimensions, and contained the phrase, "exhibits signs of structural compromise," without specifying what those signs were, when the inspection had occurred, who had conducted it, or what credentials the inspector held. It was not a report. It was a conclusion written on association letterhead and given a report number that, as I would eventually determine, had been assigned out of sequence with every other document in the association's filing system for that calendar year. I photographed the letter, scanned the enclosure, noted the document number, and called a certified arborist named Sybil Crane, who had 30 years of independent practice in the county, and whose name appeared on the state registry of licensed arborists. She came out on a Tuesday and spent 2 hours with the tree, using a resistograph drill to test for internal decay and a clinometer to measure lean, and she produced a 14-page report with photographs, instrument readings, and a professional conclusion that the oak was structurally sound, showed no evidence of root disease, and posed no hazard to any structure on or adjacent to the property. Her report was dated, signed, licensed, and notarized. I sent a copy to Renata Voss by certified mail that same week, with a letter explaining that I had reviewed the association's documentation, found it deficient under the standards set by the International Society of Arboriculture, and that I would not be removing the tree. I did not threaten. I did not demand anything. I reported the facts and stated my position, and let the paper make whatever argument it was going to make. The response came not by letter but in person, on a Friday evening when the light was already long and amber, and the oak threw a shadow across most of my front yard. Renata Voss arrived again with Philip Dern, and this time with a third person, a man named Gary Stills, who introduced himself as the association's landscape contractor and who spent 8 minutes walking around the tree with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the canopy, as though he were pricing something. Renata Voss told me that the association had reviewed my arborist's findings and found them inconclusive. I asked her what specifically was inconclusive. She said the methodology. I asked which methodology she meant. She said the board had concerns. I told her, in the same register I had used since the first day she appeared at my driveway, that I had a 14-page report from a licensed arborist, and the association had a single unsigned page, and that I was prepared to place both documents before any qualified third party of her choosing. She told me the association had the authority to make final determinations about hazard vegetation. I said I understood she believed that, and I said I looked forward to seeing the specific bylaw provision that granted that authority over trees located entirely within a homeowner's private lot. She looked at Philip Dern and then back at me and said that the association would be proceeding. I thanked her for letting me know and went inside and wrote down every word of the conversation from memory while it was still fresh, dated and timed the notes, and sent them to myself by email. Gary Stills looked at the oak one more time before he got into the truck. I photographed the truck, the license plate, and the 3 of them standing at the end of my driveway, because the association had now told me verbally they intended to take action on my private property, and I wanted a record of who had delivered that intention and when. 2 days later, I called an attorney named Rosalind Faber, who had spent 22 years in property and land use law, and whose office was 40 minutes from my house. I told her the sequence of events. She listened without interrupting and then asked me how many copies of the county survey I had. I told her I had the original, a scan on 2 separate drives, and a time-stamped email copy. She said that was a reasonable start and scheduled an appointment for the following week. Rosalind Faber was not a person who expressed excitement about anything, but she read Sybil Crane's arborist report with the attention of someone reading a contract clause, and when she finished, she asked me plainly whether I had any prior relationship with anyone on the Hawthorne Ridge board. I told her I did not. She said that was also reasonable, and she put the report in a folder and labeled it with a date and her own initials and told me to let her know the moment anything changed. The moment arrived 41 days later at 5:30 in the morning, when the sound of a diesel engine in my driveway pulled me out of sleep before the sun had fully cleared the ridge to the east. I was at my bedroom window in time to see the headlights of Gary Stills's truck and a second truck I did not recognize back to the edge of my lawn with a trailer carrying 2 chainsaws and a wood chipper. Renata Voss was there, standing at the edge of my driveway in the pre-dawn light with her red blazer and her hair already set, holding a clipboard with papers on it, and Philip Dern stood slightly behind her with his arms crossed. I dressed in under 2 minutes. I was outside before any of them had moved toward the tree, and I had my phone recording before I came through the front door. I told Renata Voss, standing at the edge of my property line, clearly and without raising my voice, that she and her crew were on my private property without my permission, and that I was asking them to leave. She told me the association had a right of access under the emergency nuisance provision of Bylaw 11. I asked her to show me the emergency declaration. She held up the clipboard and showed me a single sheet with Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association printed across the top, and a signature at the bottom that I could not read from where I stood. I told her I was calling the county sheriff, and that I wanted everyone to remain where they were until law enforcement arrived. She told the crew to begin. The chainsaw started. I called 911 and told the dispatcher exactly what was happening, who had authorized it, and that a crew was actively cutting a tree on my private property, without my consent, and without any valid legal authority that I had been shown. I stood 11 feet from the base of the oak with my phone pointed at the crew, and narrated everything I was seeing in a level voice. The time, the names of the people I could identify, the plate numbers of both trucks, the sound of the saw, the direction of the first cut. The first section of trunk came down at 5:47 in the morning. The deputy arrived at 6:19. By then the tree was in 3 pieces on my lawn. The chipper was running, and Renata Voss was in conversation on her own phone with her back to the crew, as though the outcome were already settled. The deputy's name was Marcus Welby, and he was, in the way of many first responders to neighbor disputes, visibly skeptical of the entire situation, and inclined to treat it as a civil matter requiring no immediate action from him. He asked Renata Voss for her documentation first, which she produced from the clipboard, the single-sheet emergency declaration, a copy of Bylaw 11 with certain passages underlined in yellow marker, and a letter she described as notification of the association's intent to act, dated 4 days prior, which she said had been mailed to my address. I told Deputy Welby I had not received that letter and asked her to show me the certified mail receipt. She said it had been sent first class. I showed Deputy Welby the 14-page arborist report, the county survey, and the certified letter I had sent to the association 29 days earlier. I showed him the association's original hazard notice and their unsigned single-page enclosure. I showed him the time-stamped video I had recorded from the moment I stepped outside that morning. Deputy Welby looked at the stump, which was freshly cut and still pale and wet at the center, and he looked at the stack of papers I had given him, and he looked at Renata Voss, and he said, with the flat affect of someone reading a statute, that he would be making a report, and that neither party should take further action on the disputed matter, pending a civil determination. Renata Voss told him the matter was not in dispute because the association had lawful authority to act. He told her he had noted that position. He photographed the stump and both trucks and took my phone number and told me to contact the county assessor's office to establish formal record of the boundary. I told him I had worked at the county assessor's office for 7 years and had been the person who produced the survey he was currently holding. He paused at that. He said he would include that in his report. I thanked him and let him go. I called Rosalind Faber at 7:15 in the morning and told her the tree was gone. She said, without any notable shift in tone, that she had expected they might, and that she would be filing that afternoon. The filing was a civil action for trespass and destruction of property, and Rosalind Faber attached to it the arborist's report, the county survey, the certified mail receipts for every letter I had sent and received, the time-stamped video from the morning of the cutting, my written notes of every prior conversation, and a supplemental affidavit from Sybil Crane, stating that the tree had been in sound condition at the time of her inspection, and that no hazard condition had developed in the intervening 6 weeks, that was not also present and documented as absent during her examination. The figure at the center of the claim was the replacement value of a 40-year white oak, as calculated under the Guide for Plant Appraisal published by the International Society of Arboriculture, which placed the value of the tree at $31,400. Rosalind Faber also attached, in an appendix I had not expected, a 7-page letter from a woman named Constance Allard, who identified herself as a former administrative secretary for the Hawthorne Ridge HOA, and who stated under penalty of perjury that between 4 years and 8 months and 4 years and 2 months before the date of the letter, she had witnessed Renata Voss direct the association's property management software administrator to reassign document identification numbers on 3 arborist complaints in a way that made recently generated documents appear to predate the complaints that triggered them, and that she had kept copies of the original file logs on a personal drive because she believed the reassignment was improper, and that she might someday need to demonstrate what she had seen. Constance Allard had brought her drive to Rosalind Faber's office the previous afternoon and had handed it across the desk with the careful manner of someone setting down something that had been too heavy to carry for a long time. I had known none of this when I called Rosalind that morning. She had been quietly in contact with Constance Allard for 6 weeks, since the week I first came to her office, because Rosalind Faber had recognized the document number irregularity in the association's arborist report and had made the call herself without telling me, because she had not wanted me to do anything differently than I was already doing. The drive contained 41 files, 22 of them related to properties other than mine. 7 of the 22 were from homeowners who had subsequently paid removal costs under protest and signed association settlement agreements they had not understood precluded further legal action. 3 of those 7 had paid more than $15,000 each. The hearing was held in County Civil Court on a Thursday morning in October, with the light coming through the east windows in long flat bars that reached almost to the defense table. The judge was Harmon Leach, a man of 64 who had spent 30 years on the county bench and who had, Rosalind Faber told me on the courthouse steps beforehand, a particular professional irritation with institutional parties that arrived in his courtroom with procedural assertions and inadequate paperwork. He had the original documents, the Crane report, the survey, the video, and Constance Allard's affidavit and drive. The association's attorney, a man named Burton Sales who wore a suit that cost more than my first month's mortgage payment, presented an argument centered on the broad authority language in Bylaw 11 and on the association's discretion to act in the interest of community safety. Judge Leach asked Burton Sales to direct him to the provision of Bylaw 11 that granted the association authority to act on trees located entirely within a homeowner's private lot, rather than within a common area or easement. Burton Sales directed him to subsection C. Judge Leach read subsection C aloud. He then asked whether the tree in question had been within any common area or easement. Burton Sales said the association had determined the root system to be an encroachment. Judge Leach asked for the survey the association had used to support that determination. Burton Sales said the association had relied on the arborist's report. Judge Leach noted that the arborist's report was unsigned, contained no inspection date, no credentials, and no methodology, and that the document's identification number had been assigned out of sequence with the association's own filing records by a margin of 4 months. He said the last point quietly and did not look up from the page when he said it. Burton Sales asked to consult his client. Renata Voss, seated at the defense table in her red blazer with her hair still perfectly set, leaned toward him and said something that did not change Judge Leach's expression at all. The testimony that followed took 3 hours. Constance Allard testified about the document numbering. Sybil Crane testified about the tree's condition. I testified about the morning of the cutting, speaking from the written notes I had made within 90 minutes of the event, and played 4 minutes and 22 seconds of the video I had recorded while standing 11 feet from the stump with the chainsaw running in the background. Renata Voss testified that the emergency declaration had been made in good faith on the basis of legitimate concerns. Judge Leach asked her who had signed the emergency declaration. She said she had signed it herself, as board representative. He asked who on the board had voted to authorize the emergency declaration. She said emergency actions did not require a full board vote under the bylaws. He asked her to show him that provision. She asked Burton Sales something. Burton Sales said he would need to review the document. Judge Leach gave him 15 minutes. The ruling came 22 days later in a written opinion that ran to 14 pages. Judge Leach found that the Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association had trespassed on my private property, had destroyed a tree to which it had no legal claim, and had done so on the basis of documentation that was, in his phrasing, facially insufficient and procedurally manufactured. He voided the emergency declaration entirely. He ordered the association to pay me $31,400 in replacement value for the tree, $12,800 in legal fees, and an additional $11,000 in punitive damages for conduct he characterized as willful and not merely negligent. He also ordered the association to submit its complete document archive for the preceding 5 years to the County Property Records Office for independent audit, and he appointed a court-designated neutral administrator to oversee the association's operations for a period of 2 years pending the results of that audit. He did not find grounds to sanction Burton Sales, but he noted in the opinion's final paragraph that counsel's repeated inability to produce the governing provisions his client had cited was itself a matter the relevant bar committee might wish to examine. Renata Voss was removed from the board by unanimous vote of the remaining 4 members, 11 days after the ruling was issued. She did not contest the removal. Philip Dern resigned from his deputy position the same afternoon and sent me a personal letter, 3 paragraphs, apologizing for his part in the morning of the cutting and stating that he had believed the declaration was valid and had not thought to examine the document closely. I filed the letter in the same folder as everything else and did not respond to it publicly, because the apology was genuine and the confusion was real, and it served no purpose to make more of it than it was. Gary Stills, the landscape contractor, lost his association contract as a consequence of the audit's first findings, which determined that he had been paid at a rate 40% above the county market average for 5 consecutive years, and that 2 of his invoices bore dates that preceded the work orders they were supposed to fulfill. He was not criminally charged, because the auditor found insufficient evidence of knowing participation in the document irregularities rather than opportunistic pricing, and that distinction mattered to the outcome even if it did not make the pricing any less conspicuous. The 7 homeowners whose settlement agreements had precluded further action retained an attorney as a group and filed a separate action on the grounds that the agreements had been entered under material misrepresentation of the association's authority. That case was still proceeding as of the date I finished writing this account, and Rosalind Faber had provided the group's attorney with copies of every document in my file, without charge, as a professional courtesy, and for reasons she did not need to state. Constance Allard, who had carried her personal drive for nearly 5 years before she found the right person to give it to, was offered a certificate of commendation by the County Property Records Office. She declined the certificate but accepted the auditor's written acknowledgement of what she had preserved and why. She framed that acknowledgement and put it in her hallway. The stump at 14 Sycamore Terrace is still there. I have not had it ground down. In the spring following the ruling, a pair of shoots came up from the lateral root system 18 inches east of the original trunk, each one perhaps the thickness of my wrist, both of them already showing the distinctive lobed leaves of white oak. An arborist Sybil Crane recommended told me the root system of a mature white oak can sustain resprouting for many years after the trunk is removed, and that if I left the strongest of the 2 shoots undisturbed and staked it through its first 3 winters, I would have a recognizable tree in 10 years and a substantial one in 25. I staked both shoots through the first winter. With wooden stakes I cut myself from scrap lumber and soft ties that would not abrade the bark. The second winter I left the stronger one freestanding, and it held on its own through 2 hard freezes and a week of ice. I have photographs of every stage, dated and stored on 2 separate drives in one cloud account, because that is the kind of person I am, and because at this point there is no reason to change. The county survey I used in court is framed in the hallway of the house, inside the front door, where I see it every morning. Not as a trophy, as a reminder of what it cost to have something worth protecting and of what it took to keep it. The settlement covered the legal fees and the arborist reports and left a remainder I used to have the entire eastern boundary of my property, professionally resurveyed, and the markers set in concrete. The county assessor's office sent the same crew I had once worked alongside, and when the lead surveyor recognized my name on the work order, he asked whether this was the oak tree property. I told him it was what remained of it. He looked at the stump and at the 2 shoots coming up beside it, and said it was a good-looking piece of ground and that the markers would hold 30 years easy in that soil. I thanked him and let him work. Renata Voss moved out of Hawthorne Ridge 8 months after the ruling, to a neighborhood in the next county where, as best I could determine, she held no board position of any kind. Whether that was by choice or by consequence of the association world being smaller than it appears from the outside, I could not say and did not pursue. The audit of the association's archive concluded 14 months after it was ordered and produced 2 additional formal referrals and a set of recommended bylaw amendments that the new board, seated after a general election of all members, adopted in full at their first regular meeting. The amendments required, among other things, that any hazard determination affecting a homeowner's private lot be supported by a signed, dated, credentialed report from a licensed third party, reviewed by the full board, and provided to the homeowner by certified mail at least 30 days before any action was taken. They required it because I had asked them to, in a letter I submitted to the new board chair during the public comment period, and because I had attached to that letter a copy of every document from my file and left it to them to decide whether the requirement made sense. They decided it did. They passed it without amendment and without discussion, which suggested to me that they had read the file. What Renata Voss believed, from the first morning she stood at the end of my driveway, was that authority was a thing you announced, and that documentation was a formality observed by people who had already lost. What the 40 rings inside that oak knew, and what I knew from the 7 years I had spent measuring other people's land for a living, was that the ground does not lie. The records do not lie. and the person who keeps every piece of paper does not need to raise their voice at all. The two oak shoots grew through their second spring with the particular unhurried intention of things that have survived something and know it. By the time the stronger one reached 6 feet in height, I had taken to sitting on the back step on weekend mornings with coffee and watching the light move through its leaves, which were smaller than the original canopy leaves had been but carried the same shape, the same 5-lobed symmetry that a botanist or a surveyor or anyone who had spent any time paying attention would recognize as the same tree expressing itself again from the same root system that had been drinking from the same soil for 40 years. There was nothing sentimental in the observation. It was a fact about white oaks, and it seemed to me that facts, accumulated quietly and without drama, had carried every argument worth making in this story, and would carry the ones that came after it as well. Rosalind Faber called me the following February to say that the group action brought by the 7 homeowners had reached a settlement conference and that the association's liability insurer, which had taken over the defense once the audit findings became public, had offered a figure that the group's attorney considered fair and that covered the removal costs each family had paid, their legal fees, and an additional amount the insurer's settlement document described as consequential damages, without specifying what consequences it had in mind. Rosalind said the total was just over $90,000 divided among 7 families, and that the insurer had required, as a condition of the settlement, that the association's new governing documents reflect the amended bylaw provisions already adopted at the first regular meeting. The insurer had, in other words, looked at what one homeowner with a county survey and a certified arborist report and a habit of keeping records had produced in court, and had decided it did not wish to find out what 7 homeowners with copies of the same file could produce. I told Rosalind that seemed like a reasonable decision on the insurer's part. She said it was exactly that and nothing more, and that she would send me the final documents for my own archive when they were available. She sent them 3 weeks later, and I filed them in the same accordion folder that already held the survey, the arborist reports, the certified mail receipts, the morning video, and Philip Dern's 3-paragraph letter. The folder was full enough by then that I had to press it closed with both hands to get the clasp to catch. Sybil Crane came back to the property the following April. Not on any professional errand, but because she had been curious, she said, about the resprouting. She walked around the stump with her hands in her pockets, which I noticed was the same posture Gary Stills had used, though the intent behind it was entirely different, and she crouched down and looked at the 2 shoots from below, and said the stronger one had added nearly 14 inches of height since her last visit, and that the root flare at its base was already showing the slight buttressing that indicated healthy cambial growth. She said if I kept doing what I was doing, it would outlast both of us. I said I intended to keep doing what I was doing. She said she had no doubt of that, and she accepted a cup of coffee and sat on the back step for 20 minutes, and we talked about the audit, and about the new bylaw language, and about the particular institutional habit of treating a homeowner's silence as consent, and their documentation as aggression, a reversal so complete and so common that most people subjected to it never quite identified it for what it was, until it was too late to do anything about it. I told her I had been lucky in the specific professional sense that my prior work had made the reversal immediately legible to me, and that most people standing where I had stood would not have had that same legibility available on the first morning. She said that was true, and that it was the reason the bylaw amendment mattered more than the money, because the amendment was a structural correction rather than a personal remedy, and would protect people who had none of my background and none of my files from a process that had been specifically designed to move faster than they could respond. I said I agreed, and I meant it without qualification. The County Property Records Office completed its formal incorporation of the audit findings into the public record that summer, which meant that any title search on any property within Hawthorne Ridge would now surface the audit report and the court ruling as associated documents, visible to any buyer, any lender, any attorney conducting due diligence before a transaction closed. The new board chair sent me a note thanking me for the public comment letter. I filed the note in the accordion folder, which I had by then moved to the filing cabinet in the spare room because it would no longer fit on the shelf. The oak shoot that had held through 2 hard winters and a week of ice was 7 feet tall by the end of that summer, and it cast a shadow in the late afternoon that reached almost to the edge of the eastern boundary markers the survey crew had set in concrete. Not far enough yet to shade the property line, but growing toward it. The person who assumes that quiet means harmless, and that patience is the same thing as surrender, has already made the only mistake that matters.